July 9th, 1944. A dirt lane south of Saint-Jean-de-Dié, Normandy. A Sherman from the 743rd Tank Battalion sits 30 feet from a hedgerow, engine idling, hatches sealed. The crew can hear nothing but the roar of the Continental radial behind them and the tinny chatter of their own radio net. Through the periscope, the gunner sees green. Just green. A wall of tangled hawthorn and elm, 6 feet of packed earth beneath it, centuries old. Somewhere behind that wall, a machine gun has been firing for the last 90 seconds. The commander has no idea where. 40 feet to the left, crouched in a drainage ditch, a sergeant from the 120th Infantry Regiment is screaming. He can see the muzzle flash. Second floor, stone farmhouse, left window. He is close enough to the Sherman to touch it. He might as well be on the moon. He pounds the hull with his fist. Nothing. He stands up and waves. The turret doesn't move. He throws a clod of dirt at the commander's hatch. The hatch stays shut. Because the last commander who opened his hatch on this road took a sniper round through the forehead 2 hours ago. The sergeant drops back into the ditch. The machine gun keeps firing. And 30 tons of American steel sits 20 yards away, carrying a 75mm cannon, 2 machine guns, and 4 men who cannot hear a single word he is saying. This is the problem that will kill more American tankers and infantrymen in Normandy than any German tank. Not the Panther, not the 88, not the Panzerfaust, though all of those are devastating. The thing that is destroying American combined arms in the summer of 1944 is silence. Tanks cannot hear infantry. Infantry cannot talk to tanks. And in about 2 weeks, one officer in this battalion will solve the problem overnight. With a piece of equipment that costs less than a pair of boots, uses technology from 1938, and fits inside a box the size of a loaf of bread. If this story matters to you, and if the people who fought it deserve to be remembered, take a second to subscribe and hit the like button. That's all it takes to help these stories find the audience they deserve. Here is what you need to understand about American tanks in the summer of 1944. They were not supposed to be alone. The U.S. Army had built something no other army in the world had. The separate tank battalion, not part of an armored division, not designed for sweeping breakthroughs or deep thrusts into enemy territory. These battalions existed for one purpose, to be attached to infantry divisions and fight beside the men on foot. The 743rd, the 746th, the 748th, dozens of them. They were, in the Army's own language, the infantry's armor. The idea was elegant. An infantry division hitting a fortified position, a pillbox, a stone farmhouse, a hedgerow bristling with machine guns, could call forward a platoon of Shermans. The tanks would blast the position with high explosive, while the infantry maneuvered around it. Tank firepower plus infantry eyes. Steel plus flesh. Each one covering the weakness of the other. On paper, it was the most sophisticated infantry-tank cooperation any army had ever designed. The Germans had their panzer divisions, but those were built around the tank. Infantry followed in half-tracks, serving the armor's mission. The British had infantry tanks, but their doctrine kept the two branches in separate worlds. Only the Americans had built an entire organizational structure, 65 separate tank battalions by the end of the war, whose sole reason for existence was to serve the riflemen. But there was a problem, and the problem was so fundamental, so absurd, so staggeringly obvious in hindsight, that when you hear it, you will wonder how an army that could mass-produce 50,000 tanks couldn't fix it before men started dying. The tanks and the infantry could not talk to each other. Not wouldn't, could not. Their radios operated on entirely different frequency bands. The infantry's SCR 300 used FM. The tank's SCR 508 used AM on a completely different set of frequencies. They were as incompatible as a telephone and a flashlight. You could put a tank and an infantry squad in the same field, assign them the same objective, train them together for months, and the moment the shooting started and the hatches came down, they became two separate armies, fighting two separate wars in the same 100 yards of Norman dirt. Remember that, because what happened next, the solution that one sleep-deprived captain built in a single night, didn't just fix a radio problem. It revealed something about the American way of war that the Germans, for all their brilliance, never understood. And when captured German officers finally saw it, bolted to the back of a Sherman, they had no framework to explain what it was, or why it existed. To understand how bad it was, you need to see it from inside the tank. A Sherman crew in the bocage operated in a metal box with 5 small vision slits and 1 periscope. The engine behind them produced 150 decibels, louder than a jet taking off. The commander wore a padded leather helmet with built-in headphones wired to the intercom. When he talked to his gunner, he pressed a throat microphone against his larynx. When he talked to battalion, he switched to the radio. What he could not do, under any circumstances, with any piece of equipment in the tank, was talk to the infantrymen standing 3 feet from his hull. Before the shooting started, it wasn't so bad. The commander rode with his head and shoulders out of the turret hatch. He could see, he could shout, he could point. A smart infantry officer would walk alongside the tank, and the two of them would work out a rough plan. You shoot that hedgerow, we'll go through the gap, pivot left if you hear a whistle. Then the first round came in. The commander dropped inside. The hatch slammed shut. And from that moment, the tank was deaf. The infantry tried everything. They banged on the hull with rifle butts. They threw rocks at the turret. They climbed onto the engine deck and pounded on the commander's hatch, which meant standing on top of a 30-ton target in full view of every German sniper in the parish. One method that sometimes worked was for a man to run in front of the tank, face it, and wave his arms until the driver saw him through the slit. This required standing in the open, between American armor and German guns, in the hope that the driver was looking through a 4-inch window at that exact moment. Men died doing this, not occasionally, routinely. The U.S. Army had known about the problem before D-Day. The official solution was the ANVRC-3, a radio set designed to be installed inside the tank and tuned to infantry frequencies. It weighed 34 pounds, used the same receiver as the infantry's man-pack radio, and on paper, it was exactly what was needed. In practice, almost none had reached Normandy by July. The ones that did were unreliable, and they solved only half the problem. An infantry officer with a matching radio could talk to the tank, but a rifleman in a ditch could not. Units improvised. Some tried putting the infantry's handy-talkie inside the Sherman. The tank's electrical system produced so much interference that the radio was useless. Others tried mounting spare tank radios on wooden backboards and giving them to infantry company headquarters. These weighed over 30 pounds, required a man to carry them, and were far too scarce to give every infantry platoon its own tank channel. The few that existed worked sporadically at best. So the default method remained what it had been since the first Sherman rolled off the line in 1942. Yell, wave, and hope. In the bocage, hope was not a tactic. Here is what the hedgerow did to tank infantry cooperation. Each field in Normandy was a box, 60 to 100 yards across, walled on all sides by earthen banks topped with dense vegetation. A tank entering a field could see the far hedgerow and nothing else. The infantry, spread low in the ditches and the undergrowth, could see the things the tank could not. The Panzerfaust team crouching behind the bank, the anti-tank gun dug in at the corner, the machine gun covering the gap. But they could not pass this information to the crew, so the pattern repeated, field after field, day after day. The Sherman pushed through a gap in the hedgerow. The infantry followed. German fire pinned the infantry behind the bank they had just crossed. The tank, now alone in the open field, traversed its turret looking for a target it couldn't identify. The Panzerfaust team, invisible from inside the tank, moved along the hedgerow to a firing position. The shaped charge hit the engine deck from 40 yards. The crew had 3 to 5 seconds before the ammunition cooked off. General Lieutenant Richard Schimpf, commanding the 3rd Parachute Division on the St. Lo front, noted something remarkable in those weeks. His men, many of them young and inexperienced, were rapidly losing their fear of American tanks. They had discovered that a Sherman without its infantry was not a predator. It was prey. And that fact, the fact that the most powerful weapon the Americans had in Normandy was being neutered by a communication gap that a 19-year-old with a telephone could have solved, reached the desk of Colonel Duncan, commanding officer of the 743rd Tank Battalion, sometime in the first week of July, 1944. Duncan called in his S3, his operations officer, a captain named Edward Miller, a man who, before the war, had been a signal soldier, a man who understood wires and frequencies and handsets the way a mechanic understands engines. Duncan's order was simple: fix this, tonight. What Miller built between sunset and sunrise would change the way the United States Army fights wars, and it would fit inside an empty ammunition box. The EE-8 field telephone was not a complicated piece of equipment. The Army had been using it since 1938. It was a black handset connected to a magneto ringer and a simple transmitter, housed in a canvas bag or a leather case. Every infantry company in the U.S. Army carried them. They weighed about 8 pounds. They required no batteries for voice transmission. The signal ran on current generated by the act of speaking into the microphone. They were, by the standards of 1944, ancient technology. Captain Edward Miller took one of these telephones. He removed it from its case. He wired the handset into the tank's existing intercom system, the same system the commander used to talk to his driver and gunner. He placed the telephone inside an empty .30 caliber ammunition box, bolted the box to the rear hull of a Sherman, and ran the wire through a small hole drilled into the armor. That was it. Any infantryman could now walk up to the back of the tank, open the ammo box, pick up the handset, and speak directly into the ear of the tank commander. No radio, no frequency matching, no 34-pound backpack, just a telephone and a wire. The next morning, Miller showed it to Colonel Duncan. Duncan sent Captain Robert Spears, the battalion's S2, its intelligence officer, to the headquarters of the 30th Infantry Division with the prototype and a written proposal. Spears came back grinning. The 30th loved it. They forwarded the concept to 5th Corps. Within days, ordnance teams across the Normandy beachhead were pulling EE-8s out of supply dumps and welding ammunition boxes to the backs of Shermans. Now hold that image in your mind. A telephone in an ammo box, wired to an intercom. Because I need you to understand what it looked like the first time it worked. Picture a hedgerow field south of St. Lo. A platoon of Shermans from the 743rd pushes through a gap that a Rhino-equipped tank has just cut. Infantry from the 30th Division follows close behind. German machine gun fire opens up from the tree line on the right flank. The infantry hits the dirt. The lead Sherman stops, turret traversing left. The wrong direction, because the crew heard the fire and guessed wrong. A sergeant, no one recorded his name, sprints to the back of the tank. He opens the ammo box. He picks up the handset. He says 6 words. Machine gun, right side, tree line. The turret swings right. The 75 fires. The machine gun stops. Elapsed time from contact to suppression, under 30 seconds. The day before, with the old system, the same sequence would have taken 3 to 5 minutes, if it worked at all. 3 to 5 minutes in which the infantry bled and the tank fired blind. This is the fact I want you to carry forward. The solution that transformed American combined arms in the European theater was not a weapon. It was not a new tank. It was not a better radio or a faster engine or thicker armor. It was a telephone handset from 1938, mounted in a box that had held machine gun ammunition, attached to the hull with a welder's torch, and connected with 20 feet of ordinary wire. It cost nothing. It used parts that were already in the supply chain by the tens of thousands. Any tank crew with a field telephone, an ammo box, and access to a welding kit could install one in under an hour, and it gave the American infantryman something no other soldier in any army on Earth had in the summer of 1944, the ability to command the firepower of a tank with his own voice, in real time, from behind cover. By the time Operation Cobra launched on July 25th, the massive breakout from the Normandy beachhead, hundreds of Shermans were rolling into battle with that little box welded to their backs. The Marines in the Pacific, fighting a completely different war on completely different terrain, had arrived at the same solution independently, around the same time. On Saipan, Marine tankers were welding improvised phone boxes cut from 1-inch armor plate to the hulls of their M4A2s, 2 oceans apart, 2 branches of the American military, facing 2 different enemies, and both of them reached for the same tool. Not because someone in Washington ordered it, because the men on the ground saw the same problem and solved it the same way. And here is where the story turns. Because if this solution was so simple, so obvious, so cheap, so devastatingly effective, then the question you should be asking is not why the Americans built it. The question is why nobody else did. Not the British, who had been fighting with tanks since 1916. Not the Soviets, who built more tanks than anyone. And above all, not the Germans. The army that invented combined arms warfare, that built the Panzer Division, that wrote the book on tanks and infantry fighting together. The Wehrmacht never put a telephone on the back of a Panther, and the reason it didn't will tell you more about why Germany lost the war than any battle ever could. To understand why the Germans never built a tank phone, you first have to understand what the word tank meant in the German army, because it did not mean what it meant in the American army, not even close. In October 1935, the Wehrmacht activated its first three panzer divisions in Weimar, Würzburg, and Berlin. The second was commanded by a colonel named Heinz Guderian, a man who had spent the previous decade arguing, against fierce resistance from his own general staff, that the tank was not a support weapon. It was the weapon. Everything else, infantry, artillery, engineers, signals, existed to serve the tank's mission. This was a revolutionary idea. The French had tanks, the British had tanks, the Soviets had more tanks than anyone, but all of them, to varying degrees, treated the tank as a tool that helped the infantry advance. Guderian flipped the relationship. In his model, the infantry helped the tank advance. The tank led, the infantry followed. The tank chose the objective, set the pace, and punched the hole. The infantry came behind to hold the ground, mop up resistance, and protect the flanks. And it worked, spectacularly. In Poland, in France, in the opening months of Barbarossa, the Panzer Division, tanks and infantry fused into a single high-speed formation, crushed every army it faced. But notice the architecture. The infantry that fought alongside German tanks was not regular infantry. They were Schützen, later renamed Panzergrenadier. They were trained specifically to operate with armor. They rode in vehicles, ideally the SD KFZ-251 armored half-track, which could keep pace with a Panzer IV across open country. They had radios tuned to the tank net. They dismounted when the tanks reached the objective, fought on foot to clear the position, then remounted and moved on. In this system, you did not need a telephone on the back of the tank. The Panzer Grenadier officer rode in a half-track with a radio connected to the tank platoon leader. Communication flowed through the chain of command, officer to officer, radio to radio, vehicle to vehicle. The rifleman on the ground did not talk to the tank. The rifleman's lieutenant talked to the tank platoon's lieutenant, and both of them answered to the Kampfgruppe commander, who directed the entire formation like an orchestra conductor. It was elegant, it was disciplined, and it contained a flaw so deeply embedded in its own logic that the Germans never saw it. Here is the flaw. Pay attention, because this is the hinge of the entire story. Only 1 in 4 Panzer Grenadier battalions in a panzer division actually rode in armored half-tracks. The rest rode in trucks, and trucks cannot follow a tank across a cratered field, through a hedgerow, or into a firefight. The moment the terrain turned rough or the shooting started, the truck-mounted Panzer Grenadiers dismounted and became ordinary infantry, walking, crawling, fighting on foot. And once they were on foot, they had no way to talk to the tanks ahead of them. No radio on their backs, no telephone on the hull, nothing. But that was the Panzer Division, the elite, the tip of the spear. What about the rest of the German army? By 1944, the Wehrmacht had roughly 300 divisions. Fewer than 30 of them were Panzer or Panzer Grenadier divisions. The other 270 were infantry. Their soldiers marched on foot. Their supplies moved by horse. When these divisions received tank support, and in Normandy they often did, because panzer divisions were parceled out in bits and pieces along the front, the tanks arrived as strangers. A company of Panthers attached to an infantry regiment for 48 hours. No shared training, no shared radio net, no shared language of cooperation. The Panther commander decided what to shoot. The infantry adapted. If the infantry wanted the tank to engage a specific target, the company commander had to find the tank platoon leader, physically, on foot, in the middle of a firefight, and request it verbally, or send a runner, or fire a signal flare and hope the tankers understood the code. There was no mechanism, none, for a German rifleman to speak directly to a tank crew. The thought had never occurred to anyone in the Wehrmacht, not because they were stupid, because in their model of war, communication flowed downward. Commanders talked to commanders, officers talked to officers. The man at the bottom of the hierarchy, the Gefreiter in the ditch, did not give instructions to the crew of a 50-ton Panther. That was not how the German army worked. That was not how any army worked, except one. And that exception, the army that welded a telephone to the back of its tanks and invited any private with a working hand to pick it up, was about to demonstrate what happens when the man closest to the enemy has a direct line to the biggest gun on the field. The place where this demonstration occurred has a name. The Americans called it the bocage. The Germans, after July 1944, called it something else entirely. July 25, 1944, the fields south of St. Lo. After 7 weeks of grinding, bloody, hedgerow by hedgerow fighting that had advanced the American line barely 15 miles from the beaches, Operation Cobra began with the largest carpet bombing in the history of warfare. Over 1,500 heavy bombers dropped their loads on a rectangle of Norman farmland 3.5 miles wide and 1 mile deep. The concussion killed Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American to die in the European theater, when bombs fell short into the positions of the 30th Infantry Division. The same division that was, at that moment, fielding the first Shermans with telephone boxes welded to their hulls. When the smoke cleared and the infantry moved forward, something was different. Not just the craters and the shattered German positions, something in the way the Americans fought. The tankers of the 743rd rolled into the bocage that morning with 2 new tools they had not possessed 6 weeks earlier. The first was the Rhino, a set of steel teeth welded to the bow of the Sherman, forged from the same iron obstacles the Germans had planted on the Normandy beaches. The Rhino let a tank crash through a hedgerow bank instead of climbing over it and exposing its thin belly armor to anti-tank fire. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron had invented it in a field workshop, and by late July, ordnance teams were cutting up beach obstacles and fitting Rhinos to Shermans across the American sector. The second tool was the telephone, and together, Rhino and phone, they created something the German defenders had not yet seen: a system. Here is how it worked in practice. Follow this closely, because the sequence matters. A Rhino-equipped Sherman approached a hedgerow. Behind it and to both sides, infantry from the 30th Division moved in the ditches, eyes on the next field. Before the tank pushed through, a rifleman jogged to the back of the Sherman, opened the ammunition box, and picked up the handset. He told the commander what the infantry could see on the other side, or what they could not see, which was equally important. The tank punched through the bank. The infantry came through the gap immediately behind it, spreading left and right. If a machine gun opened up, the man on the phone called the target. The turret swung. The 75 fired. If a Panzerfaust team was spotted moving along the far hedgerow, the phone rang before they reached firing position. The coaxial machine gun cut them down. Each field took minutes instead of hours. Each field cost fewer men. And each field left the German defenders facing a problem they had never trained to solve: an American tank that could see through walls. That is what the telephone did. It gave the Sherman the infantry's eyes. A tank that had been deaf and blind behind its armor was now connected to a dozen pairs of human eyes scanning every ditch, every window, every shadow in the hedgerow. The crew no longer had to guess where the fire was coming from. They were told, in plain English, in real time, by the man who was closest to the enemy and most desperate to have that gun pointed in the right direction. The Germans felt the change before they understood it. In late June, General Lieutenant Schimpf's paratroopers had learned to hunt Shermans with confidence. Isolate the tank from its infantry. Let it grind forward into the field. Move a Panzerfaust team along the hedgerow. Fire into the engine deck. By early July, the technique was killing Shermans faster than they could be replaced. By the end of July, it stopped working. The tanks were no longer grinding forward blind. They were pausing at the hedgerow. They were firing at positions that should have been invisible from inside the turret. They were traversing onto targets with a speed and precision that suggested someone was giving them directions. The Panzerfaust teams that had once approached to within 40 yards were being engaged at 100, cut down by machine gun fire before they could shoulder their weapons. Something had changed in the way the American tanks behaved. The German frontline troops could feel it, but they could not explain it, because the thing that had changed was not visible from the front. It was a small metal box, the size of a canteen, bolted to the back of the hull. A place no German soldier would look unless he was standing behind a knocked-out Sherman, examining the wreckage. And that is exactly what began to happen in August 1944, as the American breakout tore through the German lines and the first prisoners and abandoned equipment started falling into Allied hands. German officers, professionals trained in the finest military tradition in Europe, looked at the box, opened it, saw the handset inside, traced the wire through the hull, and asked a question that none of their doctrine, none of their training, and none of their 5 years of war had prepared them to answer. What is this for? A captured tank is a classroom. Every army in the war knew this. When you knocked out an enemy vehicle or overran a position where one had been abandoned, you sent intelligence officers to examine it: the armor thickness, the gun caliber, the optics, the radio, the engine layout. Every detail told you something about how the enemy fought and what he valued. German technical intelligence was thorough. They had been examining captured Shermans since North Africa in 1943. They knew the Continental radial engine. They knew the 75mm M3 gun. They knew the vertical volute spring suspension, the wet ammunition stowage, the periscope types. They had measured the armor, tested it against their anti-tank weapons, and published firing tables showing exactly where to aim to kill a Sherman with a Panzerfaust, an 88, or a Panther's 75. But the box on the back was new. It appeared sometime in mid-1944, first on Shermans in Normandy, then increasingly on vehicles across the American front. A rectangular metal container, roughly the size of a .30 caliber ammunition can, because that is exactly what it was, welded or bolted to the right rear of the hull, below the engine deck. Inside, a standard EE-8 field telephone handset, connected by wire through the hull to the tank's intercom system. No encryption, no frequency selection, no complexity of any kind. A handset, a wire, and a box. German intelligence officers understood immediately what it was: a telephone. They could trace the wire, they could see the connection to the intercom. The mechanical function was obvious. What was not obvious, what produced genuine confusion in the reports, was why it existed. Think about this from the perspective of an officer trained in the German tradition. You are looking at a tank. A tank is a weapons platform, commanded by a trained specialist, the Panzerkommandant, who has spent months learning to read terrain from a turret, to select targets through optics, to coordinate with his platoon leader by radio. His decisions are informed by training, by doctrine, by the tactical picture as communicated to him through the chain of command. And someone has welded a telephone to the back of this machine so that any soldier who happens to be standing behind it, any rifleman, any private, any man with a pair of functioning hands, can pick up the handset and tell the commander what to do. In the German military framework, this was not just unusual. It was incoherent. It was as if someone had installed a steering wheel on the outside of a locomotive so that a pedestrian could redirect the train. The system already had a commander. The commander already had a chain of command. Why would you bypass both and hand control to the lowest-ranking man on the battlefield? The answer that no German doctrinal manual contained, that no German staff college taught, and that no German officer trained in the tradition of Prussian command hierarchy could arrive at through logic alone, was this: because he can see what the commander cannot. That is the sentence that separates the two armies. The German system trusted the chain of command. Information flowed upward, through ranks, was processed by trained officers, and returned downward as orders. It was efficient. It was disciplined. It had conquered most of Europe. But it contained an assumption so deeply buried that no one questioned it. The assumption that the man with the higher rank had the better picture. The American system, by the summer of 1944, had learned something different. It had learned that in the bocage, in the jungle, in the rubble of an Italian village, the man with the best picture was not the one with the highest rank. He was the one closest to the enemy. He was the sergeant in the ditch who could see the muzzle flash. He was the corporal behind the stone wall who had spotted the anti-tank gun. He was the private at the back of the tank who knew, because he was standing in the open, with bullets snapping past his head, exactly where the fire was coming from. The telephone said, "We trust that man. We trust him enough to give him a direct line to a 30-ton gun platform. We trust him enough to skip every layer of command between a rifleman and a tank commander. We trust him enough to let him say 6 words, machine gun, second floor, left window, and have the turret respond without waiting for confirmation from anyone." No army in the world had ever formalized that level of trust at the bottom of its hierarchy, and no German officer, standing behind a captured Sherman in the summer of 1944, had the conceptual vocabulary to describe what he was looking at. He was looking at a doctrine. He was looking at a culture. He was looking at a country that had decided, without writing it down, without debating it in a staff college, without issuing a field manual, that the man closest to the problem was the man most qualified to solve it. But the phone revealed something else, too. Something that had nothing to do with trust, and everything to do with the kind of army that could take a field telephone designed in 1938, a box designed to hold machine gun rounds and 20 feet of wire, and turn it into a weapon system that changed the war. The German army that invaded France in 1940 produced some of the finest military equipment of the 20th century. The Panzer III had an intercom system that let every crew member speak to every other crew member, the first tank in the world with that capability. The Panzer IV was designed from the start with a turret ring large enough to accept bigger guns as they became available. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun was repurposed as an anti-tank weapon with devastating effectiveness. German engineering was precise, forward-thinking, and often brilliant. But every one of those innovations came from the top. The Waffenamt, the Army Ordnance Office, designed them. Krupp, Daimler-Benz, MAN, Henschel built them. Field commanders received them, evaluated them, and sent reports back through channels. The system was vertical. Ideas moved upward as proposals, downward as directives. A frontline Feldwebel, who invented a better way to mount a machine gun, could submit a suggestion through his company commander, who would forward it to the battalion, who would forward it to the regiment. If it survived each level, it might reach the Waffenamt in 6 months. If the Waffenamt approved, it might enter production in a year. It was thorough, it was methodical, it was not fast. The American infantry telephone did not go through channels. Captain Miller built it in one night. Colonel Duncan approved it the next morning. Captain Spears drove it to the 30th Infantry Division the same day. The division forwarded the concept to corps. Within 2 weeks, ordnance teams across the beachhead were replicating it. Not from a technical manual issued by Washington, not from a directive stamped by Army ground forces, but from looking at the thing, understanding it in 30 seconds, and welding one onto their own tanks. The telephone spread the way a good idea spreads in a country where any man with a wrench considers himself an engineer, laterally, virally, without permission. And this was not an isolated case. It was a pattern. Sergeant Curtis Cullen invented the Rhino hedgerow cutter in a field workshop, using scrap iron from German beach obstacles. The idea was tested in front of General Bradley, approved on the spot, and within weeks, ordnance companies were cutting up Rommel's Atlantic Wall to weld onto the bows of Shermans. No committee, no procurement cycle, no 18-month development program. A sergeant had an idea. A general watched it work. The Army built it. In the Pacific, Marine tankers on Saipan were independently welding telephone boxes to their Shermans at the same moment Miller was doing it in Normandy, because the same problem produced the same solution in 2 different mines separated by 10,000 miles. Nobody coordinated this. Nobody had to. The culture that produced both solutions was the same culture, one that assumed the man in the field was not just allowed to improvise, but expected to. This is what the German officers were actually looking at when they stared at the telephone box on the back of a captured Sherman. They were not looking at a telephone. They were looking at a system that could learn from the bottom. The Wehrmacht could not copy this, and not because they lacked field telephones or welding equipment. They could not copy it because copying it would have required dismantling the relationship between ranks that held the German army together. Allowing a rifleman to direct tank fire meant trusting his judgment over the tank commanders in that moment. Encouraging field improvisation meant accepting that the men at the bottom might know something the men at the top did not. Spreading solutions laterally, without waiting for authorization, meant loosening the vertical control that German doctrine depended on. The German army was built on the principle that a well-trained officer corps, applying proven doctrine through disciplined command, would always outperform individual initiative at the bottom. And for 5 years, that principle had been largely correct. But the principle assumed that doctrine could anticipate the battlefield. In Normandy, in the bocage, in a war that changed shape every 2 weeks, it could not. The battlefield was producing problems faster than the chain of command could process them. The Americans solved those problems with sergeants and captains and privates who had spent their civilian lives fixing cars, wiring houses, and building things out of whatever was lying around. The telephone was not a triumph of military engineering. It was a triumph of a culture that saw no contradiction between a private and a tank, between the lowest rank and the heaviest weapon, being connected by a 20-foot wire. 65 separate tank battalions served in the U.S. Army during the Second World War, more tanks than the armored divisions fielded. Every one of them existed to serve the infantry. And by the autumn of 1944, nearly every Sherman in those battalions carried a small metal box on its back, the physical proof that in this army, the man on the ground was not at the bottom of the hierarchy. He was the point of the hierarchy. Everything above him, the tank, the artillery, the air support, existed to keep him alive and moving forward. There is one more thing to tell, and it begins where this story began, on a road in Normandy, with a tank and an infantryman who could not speak to each other. The 743rd Tank Battalion stayed with the 30th Infantry Division for the rest of the war. From the hedgerows of Normandy, through the breakout at St. Lo, through the Battle of Mortain in August, where the 30th held the line against a desperate German counterattack aimed at cutting off Patton's breakout. A stand so fierce that the Germans gave the 30th a name no other American division received. They called them Roosevelt's SS. Through Belgium in September, through the Siegfried Line in October, through the frozen hell of the Ardennes in December, when the 743rd fought elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division around Malmedy and Stoumont and La Glaise, through the Roer River crossing in February 1945, through the Rhine, and finally, on April 13, 1945, to a rail siding outside a small German town called Farsleben. A sergeant in a light tank spotted the train first. Boxcars, dozens of them, sitting motionless on the Magdeburg-Wittenberg line. The doors were open. People were climbing out, skeletal, hollow-eyed, wearing striped rags. 2,141 prisoners from Bergen-Belsen, being transported deeper into Germany to be murdered before the Allied armies could reach them. The train had been abandoned by its guards when they heard American engines. The tankers of the 743rd and the infantrymen of the 30th secured the train. They scrounged food from the surrounding German villages. They carried water. They stood guard. 4 days later, the battalion reached the Elbe River, their final stop line, and the war in Europe was, for them, over. The 743rd lost 96 Shermans during the war, 141 men killed, 22 missing, 316 wounded. Total casualties, 479, roughly equal to the battalion's full strength. They burned through their own number and kept fighting. Captain Edward Miller, the signal officer who built the first infantry telephone in a single night, survived the war. He did not write a memoir. He did not give interviews. He returned to the United States and lived quietly, the way most of them did. His contribution was not recorded in the official unit history. It was preserved by his family. His son-in-law, decades later, posted the story on a website dedicated to the Sherman tank, and that is how we know his name. The telephone he built did not remain a field improvisation for long. By late 1944, the Army standardized the infantry phone as a factory-installed feature on new Shermans. After the war, every American tank, the M26 Pershing, the M46 and M47 Pattons, the M48, the M60, carried an infantry telephone box as standard equipment. For 40 years, it was as much a part of an American tank as its gun or its engine. Then, in 1980, the M1 Abrams entered service without one. The designers decided the phone was obsolete. Infantry could communicate by radio now. For 26 years, American tankers and infantrymen fought without it. In 2006, in the streets of Baghdad and Ramadi, the Army discovered that the same problem Captain Miller had solved in a Norman hedgerow was back. Infantrymen crouching behind an Abrams in an urban firefight could not tell the crew where the fire was coming from. Radio frequencies were crowded, encryption added delay, and the turbine engine was so loud that shouting was useless. The Army issued the Tusk upgrade, the Tank Urban Survivability Kit, and one of its components was an infantry telephone mounted on the rear hull of the M1A2 Abrams. 62 years after a captain in Normandy wired a field telephone into an ammunition box, the United States Army arrived at the same answer. The same handset, the same location, the same wire into the intercom. The same quiet admission that the man closest to the enemy is the man who needs to talk to the tank. The Germans couldn't explain the phone because it did not solve a German problem. In their army, the tank did not serve the riflemen. The riflemen served the tank. Communication flowed from the top, not from the bottom. And the idea that a private, tired, scared, crouching in a ditch with mud on his face and a handset against his ear, might know more about the battlefield than the commander of a 50-ton Panther, was not a thought the German system was built to think. The Americans thought it. Not in a staff college, not in a planning document, in a field workshop, in one night, with a telephone and a welding torch. And the war turned on things like that. Small, cheap, human things that no procurement office would have approved and no doctrine manual would have predicted. A telephone in a box, 20 feet of wire, and the radical, unreasonable, deeply American idea that the man at the bottom of the chain might be the most important man on the field. Thank you for watching this all the way through. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the men who fought in those hedgerows, I would be grateful if you hit the like button. It is the single best way to help this story reach people who care about it. If you are not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you do not miss the next one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, a great uncle, tell me about them in the comments. Their stories deserve to be heard. Thank you. I will see you in the next one.